Thank you all for coming, and welcome to you both. Thank you for coming. I'm going to start with an introduction of about 3 minutes or so, and then we'll get into an interesting conversation, I'm sure. This panel discussion is about museum growth and the concept of degrowth as well, and we'll get into what that means. The last quarter of a century has been a period of pronounced growth in the cultural sector, with new museums popping up across the globe, while established museums undergo multi-million-dollar extensions, add new wings, and expand their collections. Museum visitor numbers have skyrocketed to unprecedented heights, and it seems like nearly every tourist today is what we used to call a cultural tourist. With this growth and expansion has come naturally a great deal of joy for those of us in the art world who want to share as much art as possible. But it also raises a lot of interesting questions about the changing role of museums in society and the expectations that we place on our institutions. These are the kinds of questions that come up on a daily basis for people working inside museums, negotiating the larger spaces, talking about programming, artistic direction, exhibitions, development. But they're not always conversations that are had so much in public. So today we want to raise some of the interesting questions that include things like, is there such a big thing as a too big museum? Or does it ever make sense to think about more intimate, smaller spaces, more intimate programming? Are our museums obligated to program at all times with the largest possible audience in mind? And in what parts of the museum do we prefer to specialize and remain small? Of course, this is not just about architecture. The questions come up in planning, audience development, educational experiences, and ultimately reflect on the core ethos of the museum. Beatrix Ruf, to my mind, somewhat inadvertently coined the term degrowth in 20th century museums in the context of the art world. At the Verbier Summit, also in Switzerland this January, Size Matters was the theme of the inaugural summit, a gathering of about 100 cultural leaders and thinkers, including the Dutch architect Rem Koolhaas, the British-German performance artist Tino Siegal, and the British artist Christopher Thomas. I did not attend that conference, but I spoke with Beatrice afterwards and wrote a piece about the theme for the New York Times. Degrowth is a concept that was borrowed from economics. It is associated with anti-consumerist and anti-capitalist approach to sustainable development, especially at the end of a period of prolonged growth. I found it to be a rather surprising and counterintuitive notion as applied to the cultural sector, where for a while we've really taken for granted the idea that that growth is pretty much always a positive thing. My guests today are two of the world's leading museum directors from forward-thinking contemporary art museums in two major art capitals. Both of them became directors of their museums just after they had undergone a period of expansion. And so they have both dealt directly with these questions on a day-to-day basis. Beatrix, as I've already introduced, is the director of the Stedelijk Museum Amsterdam, the premier art and design museum of the Netherlands, in the heart of the Dutch capital. And Francis Morris is the relatively new director of the Tate Modern, London's leading contemporary art hub. Ms. Ruf has worked in both smaller and larger institutions. She came to the Stedelijk in 2015 from the Kunsthalle Zurich, where she had earned a reputation as a power curator and tastemaker. She arrived at the Stedelijk just after it had undergone an $159 million expansion from 2004 to 2012 that meant it had to operate in other venues for about 8 years. Ruf has subsequently re-energized the institution, bringing in artists like Siegal, who had a year-long program of site-specific live performances at the museum. And she's emphasized the museum's rich history by looking at its former exhibitions and presenting a fair amount of exhibitions that look both at the museum's past and its future. Ms. Morris became the director of the Tate Modern last year after having spent 30 years already at the institution, and is incidentally its first woman and first Briton director. She entered her new job after the museum's recent growth spurt, the opening of an iconic 10-story wing called the Switch House, designed by the Swiss architects Jacques Herzog and Pierre de Meuronat. Did I say that right? De Meuron, sorry, in the south of the existing gallery. This required reorganizing the Tate's collection display, creating new space for performance and installation art and educational programs, as well as creating more special spaces for visitors. The new building, with 20,000 square meters more space, expanded the already large exhibition space by 60%. Since taking the helm last year, Ms. Morris has distinguished herself for being what The Guardian called the woman who lets artists fly. And she's been particularly wonderful in promoting the work of women artists by Agnes Martin and Louise Bourgeois. So welcome to you, Belle. Thank you for coming. I think maybe it's useful to start out for our audience talking a little bit about what's come before, just in a broad sense, the last 10, 15 years of museum growth around the world, and how that's impacted the way we think of museums today.
Shall I begin? Yeah. First of all, it's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon. Can you hear us with these mics? Okay, great. The question is about the last 10 years, but I would just like to look a little bit further back in time, because I think it's really worth looking at the broader context of the history of museum development before we start panicking about growth and expansion. Because I think museums have, ever since their inception, been on a journey of evolution, growth, expansion, fragmentation, dispersal, and change. And all that's been completely fascinating, and it's a history that will continue. So whether it's growth or degrowth, we will move on. We're just at a temporary pause moment today in a kind of ever-evolving scenario. So it's worth remembering that the Tate Gallery, of which the Tate Modern is a child, was itself the child of the National Gallery of Art, and was born out of the need to expand that gallery in the 19th century. So the Tate Gallery, now the Tate Britain, was established at the end of the 19th century, and a century on from that, it had grown and expanded. The collection had grown, the audience was changing, the nature of art was changing, and the idea of and needs of the audience was changing. So in the 1980s, two other Tates were founded, one in St Ives in the southwest of England and one in the north of England. And that was part of a recognition of the importance of regional development and a kind of moving away from the centrist national model. And then at the end of the 20th century, Tate Modern came along. And the drive behind Tate Modern, which was an expansion but on a different site, was very much driven by the changing nature of art. And the big story in the making of art over the last 20 years is that, you know, artists are space hungry. They're working on installation, time-based media, projection. And when you think of, I've just been to the Cézanne exhibition this morning, beautiful exhibition of Cézanne drawings and small paintings. And in a small suite of about 8 galleries, there are probably over 300 items. If you were to put Louise Bourgeois in that space, you might fit in 15 major works. So these are really important factors: the needs of donors, the changing nature of art, the changing appetite for the audience, as well as the ambition and the kind of arms race within museums that have driven the kind of expansion of real estate over the last few years. So Tate Modern in particular, as part of that, I think is part of a generation of new museums that very specifically related to the kind of conjunction of institutional ambition, of museums becoming more relevant and wanting to be more relevant to a public, and that being reflected in the way artists are ever more audience-focused in their work, leading to participatory practices, immersive installations. So these things coming together have very much driven this current growth. Alongside, of course, and it's worth saying that museums there is almost as many types of museums as there are of artist practice. So when we talk about museums, it's a very broad church. So there's an arms race going on in China to build private museums, which is very different from the kind of expansionist recent history in Europe.
I totally agree, and maybe it's also important to say that, first of all, this is not a new concept. It's been discussed maybe almost 10 years now, and not in terms of, how can we size down or become smaller or prevent of actually doing what museums have to do, like to also invest in the continuity of the process, not only of collecting, but also the process of thinking of what kind of place in society the museum is. And you mentioned public space. We were talking a lot about the public space also in Amsterdam. And I think what triggered the interest in that is, of course, my new experience with an institution like the Stedelijk Museum, seeing how the institution in that process of expanding and then settling into the expansion has also changed behavior. And the question I had and we discussed and worked with in the last 2.5 years, so to say, is what are the qualities, that we gain from that continuous growth, or from the expansions and from the growing of collections, and what qualities do we lose in maybe not taking a position of taking the time to look at the changes, or taking enough time to think about the changes. And I think we're all in a very positive attitude towards it. And I think one of the great things, and I think also one of the themes of degrowth possibly could be that we insist on staying learning institutions. And that is one of the ideas I was hoping to discuss with this degrowth theme, which is not my invention at all, to see how can we stay learning institutions also towards the audiences we want to relate to and we want to grow with too, not only in size but also in a continuous reflection on how our everyday behavior changes our behavior towards art, and what we can do in, how do we have to change our presentations and our proposals to an audience by the changes we encounter in everyday life. This is, people do learn in a different way than they did 50 years ago or 20 years ago even, and it's accelerating. So we have to really also, I think, consider to change gear from being reaction and maybe therefore turning conservative also, if we give up on experiment, to being in the active role.
Maybe I could just pick up on that. I think one of the subtexts of this narrative is not about the size of the institution, but who runs the institution and who is it for. One of the things that I think is very one of the things I've noticed, certainly in London and in the place we occupy in London over the last 2 decades, is the quite significant and continuous diminishment in public space. So in the neighbourhood where I live, my local library has closed. Across my borough, all the local libraries are closing in favour of a single large library. The local shops on the corner are closing. Pubs are closing. Parks are becoming the kind of garden squares of London. You now need a key to get into them. So everywhere you look in this major city, the kind of spaces that people used to be able to hang out in, have picnics, play ping pong, just like mooch around and kill time, live, there are less and less opportunities. And one of the things about being a national museum is you are publicly owned. We are literally a public space. So with that comes a responsibility. It's not just to present a public collection which is owned by the people. It's actually to nurture a space that the people, so the taxpayers, feel is their own. And once you set that out, actually reaching those people and becoming a place that ordinary people, your kind of community, your local community, feel not just comfortable entering, but want to enter, becomes just as much as a challenge as whether you do an exhibition of Bridget Riley or Louise Bourgeois. It's really about how do you connect the people for whom your institution is meant to serve with its other core practice, which is the art in its collection. And one of the, for me, it's just an amazing opportunity to take over this wonderful, beautiful building, but that in a way was created without a very detailed brief, but certainly for art and art practice of a new time. But think, how can we make this a building that we share with our audiences? And what does that mean? What is sharing the building? I don't think it means just creating sort of social spaces, but it's actually about trying to create a way of the public kind of understanding that art is a place that they can feel comfortable with and that they can use as a tool for thinking about the world. So we've started this one floor of our new building, the Blavatnik building. We can come to donors later and philanthropy. One floor of our building is devoted to a learning space called Tate Exchange. And I wanted to mention this because Beatrix talked about learning and change coming through a kind of continuous process of learning. And for us, this is a new model. It's really about sharing the institution, and it's about making quite a small space within a much bigger space, which we co-own with 50 associate organizations. And those organizations are organizations who've come to us and said, we want to work with you in partnership. So they include the Open University, they include the University of the Arts in London, where all the big art schools are, but they also include a local radio, community radio in the East End of London, an organisation in North Wales called Valley Kids, which works with underprivileged families. It includes a group who work with children who have Tourette's syndrome. So lots of people who want to partner, or some have some interest in the visual arts. And so this is a space which we kind of give over. It's like a takeover space, not take-away space. It's a takeover space. So these organizations come in, and then they invite their friends. So a network that we make with 50 organizations then networks with multiples of those organizations. And what's happening in this space is that those people coming and asking questions, looking at the art and using it as a kind of provocation, and we're learning from those questions. And I'm beginning to see the way that a huge global museum, which we are, and we have a huge tourist audience, 60% of our visitors are international visitors to London, but maybe we can at the same time be a really, really close-knit local organisation for people in the neighbourhood and other neighbourhoods in the UK. And that, for me, that's really exciting. It's not about growth or degrowth, it's about change.
It's exactly that. We briefly spoke about that. It's different, let's say the different energies also you have with the growing tourist audience, and we of course are very much happy about that, and the local or national or regional audiences, and I totally agree. Also, we're in the process of changing the use of the building, which has now been used almost for 3 years, the way it was reopened, and we really emphasize on that public aspect also. We kind of clearing out the entrance hall to make it a public space for people to just hang out and use more actively this amazing library. It's a public library, and you don't have to buy a ticket to enter that public space. You only have to buy a ticket when you enter actually the shell of the new or the old building to enter to see the shows and the collection displays. And we also emphasize on things that are usually not visible. And I think we have really also to think about, you mentioned programming in terms of how do you create attention. And I think museums in the last years do have given in a bit of doing something which I like to call festivalization, to count on the event, to be sure that it happened. But there is so much to do and so much exciting to do with the invisible activity of the museum, which is the research, the collection, the continuously rethinking and relearning again from the narratives that are in those collections. And those aspects, I think, are so important, particularly for an audience which co-owns this public space, and that's much more an audience which is local, regional, or let's say coming back to the museum several times. And I think that is so important to combine those different rhythms and also these different types of again behavior towards an audience we would like to be involved in.
So you've both talked about the broadening role of the museum as a public space, and of course museums now are very welcoming to their public in a way that maybe we didn't think about 25 years ago. But is there ever a conflict between what you feel is your role as a public body, opening up the institution to just sort of general activity with shops and cafes and restaurants and so forth, versus the core, what might have maybe before been thought of as the core activity of the museum, which is to focus on art and to focus on research or to build collections?
Well, I suppose it's worth saying that one of the big challenges that the whole public sector in Europe, at least, face is that the public sector, it's not just the landscape and the cities that's diminishing, it's also the public funding of the public sector. So certainly in the UK, all national museums are slowly moving from being 100% publicly funded to being significantly underfunded from the public first and having to rely on private funding. And part of that equation is that we need to self-fund through retail, catering, ticket sales, and so on and so forth. But there's another dimension to that, because I'm not so sure that, I think, we all need to eat and we all like to buy postcards, and we can do that within within the core ethos without compromise. But I think perhaps more interesting to discuss is the dependence on philanthropy and what that means for museum growth. And many extensions to museums across the world are prompted by the needs to accommodate the gift of great collections. And not just accommodate the collections, but of course meet the needs of the donor to be recognized for that philanthropy. And of course, I don't know whether I can speak for Beatrice, but to be offered a work from a collection or to be offered a collection is one of the, it's a great day when a collector offers you a great work of art, and we love receiving those gifts. But I wonder whether, as we, moving ahead in time, whether we can't, as a sector, be a little bit more imaginative about how we use those gifts and how we credit and celebrate the act of philanthropy. And one of the projects that I think I'd be most, kind of proud to be associated with at Tate was the gift from Anthony Doffé, who had been a dealer, of this fantastic collection of mid-late 20th century masterpieces that Anthony amassed over a period of 2 decades, which brought to the museum, unimaginable riches in terms of American and European art, and work that we could never have acquired from our modest acquisition budgets. And this is a classic kind of collection that, for many collectors, would have therefore wanted a wing to house their collection. And there are many museums that have wings named after these great collectors. But working with Anthony, we evolved this a kind of process, a model called artist rooms, where the collection remains an entity and the collector is very associated with it. So it is Anthony Doffé's artist rooms, but the ownership is vested in the Tate and the National Galleries of Scotland, and this whole collection is shared across the British nation and is available to regional museums from the length and breadth and east to west of the country. And it's a way of dispersing heritage, of dispersing the largesse. And I think it's a kind of brilliant solution to that problem.
Well, it's wonderful you bring up this. Well, we have a similar, different, but in attitude, a very similar donation by German collector Thomas Borgmann. And I have to say I'm very impressed by the, let's say the conditions, because the donation is actually fully allowed to enter the reality of the museum. So there's no dedicated space. There is even the wish that it can be dispersed also to other museums, not only in the Netherlands, but also beyond the Netherlands. It can work as works have to work in a collection of a museum, to continuously rethink narratives. And I find that such a, I think what you mentioned in the beginning, that the realities of the public institutions have radically changed also. That's true for Britain, but it's true for the Netherlands, it's true for France, it's true for Germany, for all the, say, fully subsidized countries before. And it was a big shock for many of the institutions, and it was also a big shock, I think, in terms of thinking where the institutions came from and what kind of realities have been gained and lost again. Like the Stedelijk Museum, for example, is one of those institutions which was founded at the end of the 19th century by a group of private collectors. As many of the institutions, as we know them, have been founded like that. And they have grown into public institutions, but they also have lost on that way to the full subsidized version, so to say, this continuous negotiation of the public and private and the co-ownership of what is a societal space. And I think we have great chances in reconfiguring that and really making fantastic steps towards that continuous growth together in a way as a societal space. Yeah.
Can each of you take a moment to talk a little bit about the particular issues that came up when you took over a museum that had just undergone a major expansion, and some of the internal? The question would be did the internal functioning of the museum keep up with the pace of the growth of the external shape of the museum? And what maybe if you could talk about maybe some anecdotes about how you negotiate
that process?
Shall I start?
Yes, start.
Well, it's a really nuts and bolts question, and I don't know how much detail or how frank I should be, but I think all of us have moved apartments or houses, and if you scale up, you can never anticipate quite the knock-on effect. Whether it's you need more towels or more light bulbs, it's running a space that's doubled in size is a specific challenge, and I think the most challenging aspect of the expansion of Tate Modern is actually how you encourage your regular visitors to change their habits. And people occupy a building in a particular way, and they do particular things, and they go to particular spaces, and you actually need to kind of incentivize people to want to try out and move their affiliation from one member's room to another, or try the galleries out. So I think I would say that I'm very open to that transition taking a very long time. So I'm open to inhabiting the space, observing, seeing how it goes, and then adapting very, very slowly to encourage those kind of changes of behavior. I think one of the things that the team have found is that we have, although designed by the same architects, our old building was an adaptation of an existing building, and our new building is a new build, and they have very, very different registers of feeling. And so rather than it feeling like a monolithic expansion, it actually feels like the kind of bringing together of two very different models. And at first I thought that might be a problem, in that you feel almost a change of atmosphere as you walk across the bridge between the two buildings. But actually, in relation to breaking down the monolith, of creating smaller, more varied, different, more intimate experiences, I think that's a good thing. And therefore, one of the things that we've worked at Tate Modern is not trying to duplicate in the new building what we achieved in the old building. It's a kind of slightly new type of experience. It's more expansive, it's more open. There's no art from the early part of the 20th century. It's a narrative much more around post-1960s. There's a big focus on learning and participation. And so I think it's allowed the museum to breathe. And I suppose that in a way, we've responded to the challenges and adapted to it being a very different kind of building, rather than tried to readapt it or force on it something that it isn't.
It's very interesting. I was kind of in the lucky situation that the Stedelijk moved into the expanded spaces 2012, and I started late 2014. So the post-building trauma was already a bit over, and I think as you was quoting, so I could see, I could watch a bit, and I think everyone in the team also saw that testing out of the two and a half years in a way what also made everyone aware what is the potential of that relationship of the old building to the new building. What could we possibly use in a different way? And we're making quite some changes now in the use of the building. So, for example, we take the whole history of the collection, so the old, so to say, which is starting with the early 20th century, into the new building and rearranging the display situation with a new wall system Rimkohl has developed with us. And we use the whole ground floor for a lot of movement done out of research from the existing collection and the great old spaces of the building, the old building, we use for changing exhibitions. And I'm looking very much forward to that, reconfiguring, so to say, the already reconfigured. But I think that is what you mentioned, that you inhabit, you slowly inhabit, you find out also what an audience is seeking for, and also what the works of art need, you know. And for example, the decision to take the chronology of the collection into the new building had exactly to do with the fact that we want to read the collection in a different way. We want to integrate, de-hierarchize media. So going into a space where we can reconfigure without the linearity of one room after the other seemed to be very exciting to do. So I think we can fantastically learn from the spaces, but also from dysfunctionalities we find out in the process of using them. So it's exciting.
Just got the signal that we should wrap it up, but I do have one last question before we open up to the audience, which is the question of what do you foresee for the future? Do museums continue just get bigger and bigger? Is there a point at which they stop? Is there something that's too big, or do we start to see museums maybe starting to minimize their activities in any way?
Actually, I think I feel pretty sure that for the foreseeable future in the UK, the development will be around will be around collaboration, and will be around working with large organizations, working with small organizations, central organizations working with regional organizations, and a much more collaborative nurturing of margin and center. And I think there's fantastic opportunities there. And certainly when I think about my learning curve at the moment is really dictated by my contact and experience with regional museums and people who are working, with local communities very, very closely. So I think although I'm not sure about the physical nature and size of institutions over the forthcoming years, but I think the experience of audiences will be much more about contact, intimacy, friendship, sharing. I think, this is a world that's facing huge challenges, and I think we will be, we need friends, we need to hold hands with each other, and that's what it'll be about.
I would just want to extend on that, what you already mentioned with actually Tate, how the collection is being used in the whole country. In the Netherlands, there's a great project called Collectie Nederland, that whenever a museum thinks about collecting an artist or adding work, you check with what's in the places already. And I do think that ownership, not only in terms of physical ownership of works, but also ownership of places will be definitely something we will have to do big steps. And I find it very exciting to think about co-ownership, not only of the museum as a public space, but also co-ownership of building this collective archive in the future.
You mean that museums can share between them?
We actually co-own.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good idea. Okay, great. We have some time for some questions from the audience, and I think there's some microphones floating around out there, maybe? Yeah, okay. Let's have...
Oh, thank you very much. You talked about philanthropy and philanthropists. I think public institutions in some countries have to face another issue now, is that philanthropists don't give anymore their collection to public institutions, but prefer to open their own museum. We have the example, for instance, in the States with Eli Broad, who was a trustee and gave a lot of work to the MoCA, and has preferred now to open his own Broad museum directly in front of the MoCA. In France, we had two major companies who were giving money sponsorship to exhibitions, and now they prefer to open Fondation Vuitton, have their own collection. Pinot will open his own foundation. He doesn't give his collection to public institution, doesn't give his money anymore. How do you explain this new phenomena? Is this just a manifestation of super ego, or is it kind of failure of public institution? And for UK and for Netherlands, is this question which is also accurate or not at all?
Well, I think it's worth remembering that many of the great public institutions, or the institutions we think of as public, began as the indulgences of private collectors. And I speak even of my own institution. Henry Tate was a private collector when he gave his work to found what was then the National Gallery of British Art. And I think it's also worth saying that many of the American public museums that you think are public museums are in fact private museums, and they're entirely controlled by groups of wealthy philanthropic collectors. So it's, to me, the issue is not really around the proliferation of private institutions. It's about how publicly, the public ethos and the possibility of them acting in a publicly minded way alongside their private motivations and endowments. It's a complicated issue, but you know, the world is a richer place for those private public museums as long as they serve the public.
I couldn't add to that. It's exact. The fact, as mentioned as well, the Stedelijk Museum also was a foundation of private collectors, and I do think this we see a time of a lot of foundation of private institutions, and the pudding is in the eating. It's on the long term you will see which ones turn into the Tate, the Guggenheim, the Menil, and I think it's an exciting process. And an exciting time we're in. But I do also think that there is a new energy coming in relating to the already existing institutions, particularly in those countries where you had full subsidy and the institutions, or the collectors in particular, as far as I hear it from the Dutch collectors often, that there's a new relationship to the institutions. They are building up again because they felt alienated also from the fully subsidies. So we have many movements at the same time going on, and really the pudding will be how big will be the public ethos and impact also.
This gentleman over here with his hands on it. Get him a mic.
Francis, Beatrix, thank you very much. Wonderful presentation, and looking at the number of people here, it's spectacular. One of the questions that my wife and I get as we work with both of your institutions very often is, how do you go about acquiring new young artists, and what is the way that you go about that, and how does that affect growth or degrowth?
Yeah, of course, I think there is different approaches to how to add young artists that are not confirmed yet. I think one of the models I believe in is also experimenting with exhibitions. And as you know, in the last 2 years, we have presented many younger artists that we think we also should get involved in collecting them. But it has to do very much also in reading the DNA of the collection and questioning or asking questions towards the existing collection. I think it always has to be looked at to how do we continue narratives, or how do we, in an important way or interesting or disrupting and challenging way, also go away from a line that has been written. And I do really believe in the experiment of the experience of exhibitions with those young generation of artists.
I should. It's interesting. I think Tate's collection is a kind of hybrid collection of British art from 1400 to the present day, and international modern art, pretty global from 1900 to the present day. And we look at younger artists in two different ways. With British artists, I think we're very active in being continuously aware of what's happening, almost from kind of graduate school onwards. And at Tate Britain, we have an Art Now room, so we can work and have a kind of ongoing relationship with artists from a very early point in their careers. And of course, the work around the Turner Prize is a way of every year rethinking what's going on. And we tend to acquire quite a lot of emerging British art. So the collection really sets out to document as well as celebrate. So we're in a way quite happy to show the emergence of the great stars and sometimes the disappearance of the early shiners. In terms of international art, we tend to intersect at a much later stage in an artist's career, and that's because it's really a much more networked collection around kind of hot spots around the world. I don't think that places like Art Basel help us engage with emerging and younger artist practice. So I would say that we're very aware of artists working beyond the marketplace, without commercial support. And it's really important to us that our curators, especially the younger curators, are really active in those alternative areas of practice.
And we need all those great institutions of mid and small size to actually
really important, yeah.
introduce us to.
Yeah. Again, we steal other people's ideas when we look at the small and medium scale museums and galleries, see what they're doing.
Maybe it's good to also follow that up by asking about your acquisitions budgets. Are they growing as well as, or are they remaining about stable? Are they declining? Yeah.
Our acquisitions budget is extremely complicated, but the budget from our, as it were, from government funding has been in steady decline since the 1980s. It's still there, it's hanging on in there, but it's very, very reduced. But it has been more than compensated for by the incredible support on a really long-term basis of over 300 individuals who help us acquire work from different regions in different media. And that has been the most, actually one of the great things about losing some of that public support has been the growth of this private network of friends, patrons, committee members and donors.
So I'm fairly new there also. There is no given public acquisition budget for the Stedelijk anymore, but it is part of our infrastructure when we make the decisions. And also, luckily, there is a growing group of people really actively helping, which is fantastic. And the Netherlands, luckily, still has quite a few very powerful foundations who can be matching foundations. If you think of the Rembrandt-Vereniging or the Mondrian Fund, which really still can play an important role in helping and supporting acquisitions, also acquisitions of larger scales.
We have time for just one last question. Sorry about that. Over here. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, I'll stand. Hello. So this is a question, I think, mainly for Francis. And this is to do with the growing number of support from the friends. And it's also to do with whether it comes with certain conditions, even soft ones, and how is that managed. For example, places which are less accessible, quite understandably so. Everyone is in hot pursuit of these friends, meaning galleries and as they should be. But then artists how do you select and how do you maintain a certain amount of autonomy, if at all you want to, and sovereignty with who you select from the relatively farther away places where you may not necessarily have access to the entire range. I think some of this you already answered by saying that you watch the smaller organizations and see who they are going after. But then I think as such an important and powerful institution, I suppose artists would, of course, like me, desire that the role of the institution would be also to be a little bit more stringent with how you manage to cut through the softer conditions which one imagined, as such as, you know, a certain artist being more visible or better promoted. And how do you deal with that?
Okay, I think we don't have very much time, but I do want to say one thing, and a number of our fantastic patrons are here. I think we regard it as really important that we have a leadership role in building the collection, and we seek consensus with the people who support us. And it's a learning process that we undertake together. It's incredibly important when we're thinking about how we represent parts of the world that are very far from our own centre, that we don't just work through the existing networks of galleries, particularly commercial galleries and advisors on the ground. And one of the things that I've learned from early on in my career is to ask artists. Ask the senior artists who they think are really, really interesting emerging artists, and ask the emerging artists who they think are their mentors and peers. And if you do that, you move away from the commercial gallery sector very, very quickly, and you make extraordinary discoveries. So we try and be as independent as we can, but as really as sensitive and, you know, absorb the kind of local context as much as we can.
You want to add something on that? Yeah.
What ask the artist is a good point.
Okay, great. Well, that's all that we have time for today, but thank you all so much for coming, and thank you to Beatrice and Francis for participating in this very interesting conversation.